Well, I think that one of the things that I'd like you to clarify for our
Sure.
audience is to really enlighten us as to the degree to which Curtis Yarvin is really relevant to
Hmm.
some of the central figures in the Trump administration and who those are and what is particularly JD Vance, whether that be Elon Musk, in the larger thoroughfare. We're talking about the guy who was also the founder of PayPal. Who's the guy behind JD Vance? What's his name?
Peter Thiel.
Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel,
Yeah.
who also has a large role. How much do you think that he holds sway? And we'll get to his particular philosophy in a little bit, but how much do you think he actually holds sway over those guys in terms of their worldview?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd say that he holds sway exactly. I think that it's certainly true that, JD Vance most prominently has said very positive things about him, has cited him in the past as a friend and influence. I mean, that much is a matter of public record. As far as, and I actually, I guess I would say one other thing about that, which is that I do think that, you know, Vance in particular, if you look at his evolution, because back in, when Hillbilly Elegy, came out, right, in 2017 or 18, whenever that was, right, like
Right.
he was as recently as that, you know, he was somebody who lots of liberals liked, because he told them things that that they wanted to hear about the Trumpist base, and and he was certainly a very adamantly anti-Trump guy. In fact, there's a college friend of his who got so pissed off at Vance, he like shared a bunch of their old emails with the New York Times, and in there, there's an email where Vance goes so far as to say that he thought that Trump might be America's Hitler. So he did this. He really did this very rapid 180 in the greater scheme of things, like over the in between then and 2024, of course, when he became Trump's running mate. And it's always hard to tell with these people how much of this is just sort of cynical, positioning that you think you can catch a wave and ride it, and how much of it is ideologically earnest. But I guess in Vance's case, I kind of do think that there was a real ideological transition that happened there, and and I mean, I guess my reason for thinking that is that to a much greater degree than most politicians in that orbit, he really seems to have imbibed a lot of just this like strange internet reactionary stuff. And if you look at some of the podcasts that he was on in those years and so on, it's, I do. I mean, I think it would actually be more comforting to think that it was completely cynical, but I actually think there might have been some real ideological transition there, in which case, if that's true, somebody like Yarvin actually might be a real influence. So the point of connection would be Peter Thiel, who, as you said, is this, is this wealthy oligarch who JD Vance actually like worked for during his phase of living in San Francisco, actually, and working as a venture capitalist, and I think who kind of brought him into touch with this kind of world. I think outside of Vance, again, it's hard to say, but here's the basic reason to think that sure. So Thiel is this like mega donor who likes Yarvin and has sponsored Yarvin, and is also basically solely responsible for funding the early phases of Vance's career. And so I think it's plausible that you could have some degree of influence elsewhere. I mean, in general, with the question of how much any politicians are listening to any intellectuals is always a little bit iffy. But I think that the reason to me, more than anything else, to think that Yarvin is a meaningful influence on the new Trump administration is just that, Doge, right? What they've done with that, does really resemble a lot of what Yarvin has always pushed, right? That they have that he's, one of the say, the phrases that he's known for is rage, which stands for retire all government employees, and it's, in general, somebody like, Yarvin, he thinks, he's one of these people who thinks that it's like really, really important if you're going to sort of seize hold of the state and use it for more conservative ends, to sort of clean out, the deep state. And, that's, I mean, that is what much more aggressively this time than last time they've been trying to do.
Not only that, he's publicly stated that Americans need to get over their problem with dictatorship.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he has. I mean, that's why it would be so disturbing if he was a real influence, because I mean he's a self-described monarchist. I mean, we can get into what he means by that, because I think he's a little bit coy and kind of talks out of both sides of his mouth about what he means by it. But I mean, he is very openly critical of democracy per se.
No, absolutely. One of the things that I'd like to jump back and you were talking about in terms of
Yeah.
when JD Vance was participating in some of these podcasts and where it was more influenced by some of this more online culture. Do you ascribe that to his age more so than anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's a factor. I mean, that he's more likely to have been exposed to this stuff than older politicians. Older politicians would be. I mean, I'm sure that that's true. I mean, and in general, I think a lot of the sort of energy among young right wingers does trend in these kinds of strange directions that we're talking about. I mean, it's I don't know if you remember when Ron DeSantis was running for president. There was a one of his staffers who was fired because he made these pro DeSantis ads. I mean, they weren't officially put out by the campaign, but they were put out, by they were made by the campaign, and they were officially put out by some separate pro DeSantis thing. And that one of these ads had this sort of deep cut 1930s fascist imagery in it. And that guy turned out to be Nate Hochman, who's written for the National Review and has had all sorts of grants and fellowships and stuff in the right wing, think tank world. And, the only reason I bring that up as part of the answer to your question is I think that's probably revealing that somebody like that, right? You'd think that the 1990s version of that guy would have just been a very boring, buttoned down, somebody who'd whose big influence would be, I don't know, Milton Friedman or somebody, right? And I think now, for whatever reason, a lot of the sort of young, enthusiastic rightists are trending in creepier and more authoritarian directions.
What do you ascribe that to?
I mean, I think that in some sense, probably at least part of the answer is that the way that I think the long-term effect of post-Cold War ideological disorientation on the right, that for decades they had this sort of big unifying enemy that everything was all about, and even so I think probably gradually over the decades since then, that the loss of that has probably made them go in stranger directions. I also think that some of it's just that this sort of ambient sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo that that like might have turned like young progressives towards like supporting social democrats who are like maybe way to the left of what they what their equivalents would have supported decades before. I think that the sort of widespread sense that that there's something broken, that what we've got right now isn't working, that right wingers will try to come up with a right wing theory of that, and that's going to gravitate in much more disturbing directions.
So what you're basically saying is that an overall malaise towards the general systemic functioning of the machine created a kind of a kind of Bernie Sanders to the right, if you will, of a certain kind of. I hate to use the term right wing populism because I think
Sure.
it's an oxymoron, but
Right.
a certain kind of right wing reaction that pushed these kids to authoritarianism. Do you think part of it has to do with this often discussed crisis of masculinity discourse?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, I think that I think that has to be in the mix. I mean, it's I think that they're like I think that right wing authoritarianism is always going to be bound up with reactionary views about gender, and I also think that reactionary views about gender are going to have like a sort of particularly fertile ground for a lot of reasons. Right now, I mean, given that like given that, I mean, for one thing, some of the stuff that you and I have discussed on this show in the past, that a lot of young men don't feel like they're going to be in a position anytime soon to do things, to get married, have children, have the all of that stuff, have certainly have the economic success that they would associate, with being in a good position to do those things, especially people.
Replicate patriarchy in the way that it's traditionally been
Yeah,
dictated.
yeah, right. And which it's like, look, I mean, there's a obviously there's like a reactionary sexist component to that, right? But it's also tapping into like extremely legitimate frustrations, right, with the the way that it is bad, right? If people don't feel like they can afford to you know like they can they can afford to do the things that their parents did, and and they'll be in a good position to, and all that. And I think that um but I also think that on the right, you often get a bad theory of that, right? Like you sort of notice that fewer people are doing these things, and that's not wrong. But then you attribute it to to feminism, to to cultural change, all of that stuff. Much more than you attribute it to like concrete economic causes. And also, look, there is something to be said here about the fact that I do think that there, I mean, I do think that there is a kind of progressive cultural politics that you get sometimes that legitimately does communicate to young men the idea that we don't particularly like them, right? I mean, that's I mean, I do think that's a real thing.
You mean like pushing around phrases like
Yeah,
toxic
exactly.
masculinity?
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah, I mean, if the only time you ever say the word masculinity has the word toxic next to it, I mean, that does communicate, that does communicate a message that a lot of young men are probably going to hear that way.
Wow. So you do believe that there's some legitimate concern on in spaces of men that the established normative discourse coming out of progressive thoroughfares regarding gender theory or gender ideology and gender in general might kind of not be too cool with men.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, I think we need to be able to walk and chew bubblegum here, right? Like, obviously, gender equality is important. I mean, that's a sort of non-negotiable commitment, for any kind of principled leftist. The obviously the rights of sexual minorities are incredibly important, right? I mean, like all of that's true, right? But I also do think, like, look, you can say all that and still worry. It's like, okay, but like culturally, is the kind of discourse that we're communicating about men, what is that communicating about how we feel about this half of the population, especially because the numbers do kind of speak for themselves. I mean, as far as the I mean, these things are always a matter of degree, right? I mean, like it's complex populations, right? It's always it's always it's never all or nothing, right? But like, but I think if you do look at a lot of polls, I mean, there has been a real shift of a larger portion of young men towards the right, and there is a bigger gender gap, than there used to be, and that should be troubling, right? Because you can't, there's no way to achieve any kind of worthwhile political program, right? I mean, you need to have a solid majority of the population, and half that population is male.
No, absolutely, I agree with you. But I mean, I see some of the reaction that comes out of this right wing discourse about women, and it's just like the misogyny
Oh my God, totally, yes.
is off the chain, man. It's just
Yeah.
it's really ridiculous. And I
I
mean,
mean, my God, I mean, this is like an era where we have people a lot of people, like not just people who are on Twitter all the time, right? Who idolize Andrew Tate, who is like who's like so vile he makes me like miss Jordan Peterson, right? It's like, oh, that wasn't so bad, right? That like I mean, Peterson's just a guy with a bunch of dumb opinions. I mean, Tate is actually a sex trafficker.
right? No, absolutely, yeah. Him, Nick Fuentes. I mean, those guys are they have hardcore misogynistic views. It definitely breeds a rather toxic cocktail. But back to the Dark Enlightenment and Charles Yarvin. Well, maybe we can actually tie this
Yeah,
in. How does
yeah.
this actually? How does this play out? Like, what are Yarvin's opinions on gender and family? Is he a traditionalist? Is he? I mean, does he believe that the government should be outside of the role of the family, or that
Hmm.
government should be? Is this something that you have not investigated? I mean,
Yeah,
does he
this is not really this is
right.
not really something I've investigated. So Curtis Yarvin, I will say, um, I don't think that he is at least hyper traditionalist about that stuff. And this maybe circles us back to like the first thing you asked me about, chains of influence. But because even though he does seem to have exercised some degree of influence on JD Vance, or at least certainly Vance's rhetoric, and again, to whatever extent there has been a real influence, I find that incredibly disturbing, for reasons that we've kind of touched on a little bit, and I'm sure we'll get into more. But I think that, but he's certainly not the only influence, right? So like um, somebody like Vance, for example, right, is he's a adult convert to Catholicism, and of course there are liberal Catholics and conservative Catholics and all of that, but obviously Vance is like a very conservative traditionalist Catholic, and he and Vance has like incredibly traditionalist views on this stuff. Whereas Yarvin, as far as I can tell, is not religious. He's I think that it would be very unsurprising if, of course, right, if there were some bad and regressive views about gender, women, gay people, trans people, all of that stuff in the mix. But I will say that's not something I've really seen him talk about a lot, right? Like I don't think that I don't get the sense whatever he might think about that cluster of subjects, at least from my interactions with him and what I've kind of looked at in his interactions with others, I don't get the sense that that's like a big thing that, drives him in the way that it might be a big thing that drives other people in his coalition.
Okay, great. Well, then, what exactly do you find are the core tenets of his ideological philosophy, and how do they relate to the governance of the Trump administration?
Sure. So Yarvin, um, Yarvin is somebody who I think maybe the first thing, and uh, as sort of frivolous in a certain way as this might seem, I think maybe even the most important thing about him is that he really idolizes and romanticizes tech CEOs, people who he sees as these like modern, captains of industry who've like through their business genius supposedly, have started up these successful companies and bring all of this innovation. And I think that really is I think that really is a major part of his worldview. And when he talks about, so again, he likes to, I should also say that something that's like just very true of Yarvin stylistically is that, you know he's often really enjoyed the being edgy and provocative, but as I said earlier, I think he often talks out of both sides of his mouth a bit about exactly what he means by some of it. When push comes to shove. But like the reason that I start with the part about the tech CEOs, and and his admiration for them, his association with them, again, his certainly his friendship, for example, with Peter Thiel, um, is that I think that it's a big part of his worldview. I think it's a big part of his sort of case against democracy. That it's like, oh, look at these companies that are internally dictatorships, and look at all of the wonderful innovation and success and efficiency that they bring. Um, and yeah, I think he thinks that he thinks that the on some level, right, whatever exactly this is supposed to mean, right, like he thinks that the United States would be better off if it sort of had somebody who could really exercise that kind of CEO like power over the American state. Um, and so he likes to express this by throwing around, this phrase, monarchism. And when he oftentimes, what I've noticed, right? So before my debate with him a few years ago, I watched a couple of his previous, his previous, appearances on shows and whatnot. And I think that when he wants to look reasonable, he'll sort of downplay the monarchism, and he'll just say basically, oh, I just mean like a president who can like really take charge. And he'll even do this thing where he'll actually try to sort of turn the tables on progressives by saying, oh, look, FDR was kind of like a monarch because look at how Congress was just willing to rubber stamp whatever he did, and he got in all this big dramatic stuff really quickly, right? So he was able to like kind of govern like a CEO. And then when he's trying to be more edgy and provocative, he'll start using these comparisons about like the fall of the Roman Republic, and like we need somebody to be like our Augustus in that process, and he'll even say ideally it would be one of these tech CEOs who would do the job, which is however much causation there might be there, right? Like however much people are doing this because they listen to him, or whether it's just because they're thinking along similar lines. it is really striking how much of the beginning of the second Trump administration resembled that picture. That you had tech CEO Elon Musk, who I mean everything is always so chaotic and it changes so quickly. It's hard to say how much this is still true, but in the first couple of months of the Trump presidency, I mean, he almost seemed to be the co-president. That he was. I mean, like he did a press conference in the Oval Office where like Trump was just sort of sitting down at the desk while Musk was standing there talking to reporters. He Trump got everybody to turn around and do a standing ovation for Elon Musk at the State of the Union, and Musk was doing a lot of the kinds of things that that Yarvin will talk about, right? So Yarvin is somebody who, in his worldview, and I think that there's like a whole tradition he's coming from here, like James Burnham, who believed that for people who aren't familiar, I mean, you've probably talked about the show before, but like Burnham is somebody who actually used to be a Marxist, and then he became convinced that like the sort of real ruling class wasn't the capitalists; it was the sort of entrenched managerial elites that were the sort of real rulers, and to a very great extent, that's what Yarvin thinks. That so he'll talk about what he calls the cathedral, which is more or less his term for like academia and the media, but he thinks that these are the sort of these are the people who are like really like setting the ideological agenda for everybody, and that the sort of actual rulers, which he associates with with like with again like sort of permanent bureaucrats, in the deep state, etc. That like these things were all sort of moving as one, right? So like there was a part of the debate that I did with him where we were talking about the media, and I kind of made what I thought was a basic point that it's like, look, if you want to know what the biases are driving the media, you should look at who owns the media, right? If you want to know, who if you want to know what the what the sort of relevant biases that are driving the Washington Post, for example, it's awfully relevant that the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, right? And Yarvin just kind of completely rejected that, right? He said, no, it's it's like the newsroom, which is part of again this sort of like establishment of like academia and media elites, and sort of deep like permanent government elites, that are driving everything. And and I guess the last thing I would say about this is just it's really important, I think, for understanding certainly Yarvin's own worldview, and also when somebody like JD Vance says Yarvin like things, like what drives that there's no level on which they think it's like, oh, okay, so we have this like sort of liberal managerial kind of ruling class, and we don't want that because we just want like the people to be in charge or something like that, right? Like there's like certainly in Yarvin's case, there's zero pretense to believe in that, right? Like he thinks that we're going to be governed by some kind of elite one way or the other. He's just very explicit that he wants it to be more his kind of elite, right? Which is why we need this like CEO like figure who can purge the existing elite and bring it in what he sees as a better direction.
So basically, he's an authoritarian.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, he is. I would also say actually one thing that I don't see. I mean, yeah, he's absolutely an authoritarian. Like he absolutely takes it for granted that people are not going to meaningfully govern themselves. He thinks that he's very explicit that public opinion is can just be manipulated, right? Like it's that's not like organic. That he doesn't think there's that sort of like meaningful democracy is like possible one way or the other, right? Most people just aren't going to pay that much attention to government, right? We are going to be governed. He just thinks the question is just who does the governing. Whether it's like the sort of liberal elite that he doesn't like, or one that would be more to his taste. Um, and I guess the other thing I would just say is that it's kind of it's always a little bit surprising to me that with how much attention Yarvin has gotten, especially since Trump won again, that of course the authoritarianism does get a lot of attention as it should, right? But like, what doesn't get a lot of attention, and what I really wish somebody would ask, for example, JD Vance about, right? Since it's since he has like explicitly like said positive things about this guy, is that you were asking earlier about Yarvin's views about gender, and I had to kind of say, well, I haven't really heard him talk a lot about that explicitly, but certainly on race. I mean, this I was actually kind of shocked, right, by how much of an old school racist he struck me as being.
So he's pretty much a eugenicist, isn't he?
I mean, yeah, it seemed that way to me. I mean, he had. I've seen him be a little bit evasive when he's sort of asked direct questions about like, oh, how much do you think is like genetics or culture, right? Versus culture, but yeah, I mean, he does really seem like this very this very upfront kind of old school racist in a lot of ways, right? That he believes very explicitly, right, that the world is divided up into peoples, who have different characters, and that the reason that some countries are successful and other countries aren't is because the character of its people, and he I have I mean, there was a point in well, there's actually quite a bit of our debate that ended up being devoted to arguing about the history of U.S. meddling in Latin America and the consequences of that, because he, I mean, he has this sort of story that it's like, oh, the thing that's wrong with like American foreign policy is that like, you know, that well-intentioned liberal do-gooders who do naively try to promote democracy everywhere, and it doesn't always work, and I was trying to make the very basic point that very often, especially in Latin America, American foreign policy is often like served to undermine democracy, to overthrow democratically elected left-wing governments, for example, right? So we went back and forth about that extensively, and one of the examples that I went that like I spent a good bit of time on was Haiti, and he I mean, he was very adamant and like sort of said, oh no, you can't blame U.S. meddling for that. It's that like the problem the problem is the problem is the Haitians themselves. If you took everybody in Haiti and put them in Japan, and everybody in Japan and put them in Haiti, the Japanese people would still be successful, and so like all that stuff, right? It's like it was really kind of like it really had like honestly, like I kind of came in like the rest of his views that we've been talking about. I sort of knew going in that he thought all of that, right? But I was actually pretty shocked by how upfront he was about this, because like in most right wingers that I've dealt with like will not be anything like that explicit about it.
Even in today's context, like Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk has drifted more in that direction in the last few years, but I think even now Charlie Kirk would probably be not quite as upfront about it as Yarvin is, and certainly when in 2021, which is when that conversation happened, he wasn't he wasn't anything like that upfront about it. In fact, I think Charlie Kirk is probably an interesting case, because some of the people that you're talking about, that you mentioned earlier, right, Nick Fuentes and those people, right, like really used to go after Kirk pretty hard back when, as like this sort of like it's like cucked establishment conservative, right? And I think that he has, my sense. I mean, I haven't like closely kept up or anything, right? But like when something from Kirk does cross my radar lately, my sense is that he's like, my sense is that like the pressure kind of works, right? That he has like traveled like a good bit in their direction over the course of the last few years.
Ah, interesting. Wow. So what's fascinating here is that you're exposing that Yarvin is much more transparent about his beliefs in racial hierarchy than your typical run of the mill right winger or right
Yeah,
wing ideologue per
yeah, I
se.
think so.
And the fact that, well, that would go in line with the fact that JD Vance, who is known to be a eugenicist in terms of him trafficking in what would be underclass ideology for the white poor, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
kind of believing that they're kind of doomed to their lives of failure. I mean, now if he's saying that about the white poor, what do you think he's going to be saying about the black poor? You
Right,
know,
right,
so
exactly. Yeah.
so uh, what is it? What do they believe in things like transhumanism? I mean, do they talk about those kind of things? I mean, have you ever heard them talk about this that kind
Uh,
of?
I haven't seen Yarvin talk about transhumanism, which is actually interesting because, uh, I mean, he's definitely, because again, I mean, some of this stuff does come out of Silicon Valley, so which is obviously where transhumanism comes out of, right? But
Right.
I haven't, I yeah, I can't think of a time that I've happened to see him, address it one way or the other. I suspect he hasn't, if only because uh, I think that some of the people who are fans of him probably wouldn't be if he had, right? Just because I think that like again, somebody like JD Vance, for example, who, to the extent that, again, we sort of take seriously all of his expressed ideological commitments, that he's not just kind of trying to pander to a certain, demographic or whatever, that like he really does think all of this stuff. Somebody like JD Vance, who's like a sort of, you know, um, you know, traditionalist Catholic kind of reactionary, I assume wouldn't like any of that, right? But
Right.
and so I would assume that if Yarvin trafficked in any of that, that would probably be a big turn off for that crowd. But again, I'll admit I haven't seen him talk about it one way or the other.
Can you talk about his belief in what he calls it? What I think he calls it the technocracy, or the technical state in terms of their control of how they govern. I believe he calls it technocracy. I mean, he might have a different term.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that he, I mean, when Yarvin, will talk about, like this stuff. Like he used to have a blog that was called Mencius Moldbug, and I think especially back in that era, right? He used to throw around this. Throw around this term that I mentioned earlier, the cathedral, a lot. That was, I mean, there were points where, to the extent that he was sort of talking about like ideological, like media consensus. I mean, it would almost make him sound like an evil version of Noam Chomsky, But I think that, you know, but I think that what he, um, what he means by it, right? I mean, like again, like the cathedral seems to be like roughly his term for the media and academia, sort of like manufacturers of ideological consensus, um, and he has, and it does seem to be the case that he thinks that this stuff has just tremendous power in a way that if you come from a different sort of ideological tradition, it might even be hard to wrap your mind around how important he thinks that stuff is. Because, you know, if you sort of certainly come out of a basically materialist view about history and politics, then you think that the role of ideology is just to sort of rationalize what would be happening anyway. I mean, I know I'm simplifying, but I mean, basically, right? You know, that it's there, you know, it's there to rationalize what's already happening, right? That it's not the, you know, consciousness of men that creates their being, but the other way around, right? And whereas I think that in his worldview, I think that the ideology really is in the driver's seat, right? That things happen in history and politics, you know, because of you know, ideological commitments, you know, in a basic way. And so, you know, I think that he thinks that a lot of the power comes comes from that, right? That you know, I mean, I think he, you know, I mean, I think I remember him saying, you know, in one of the earlier debates his I watched that, like, if you imagine, you know, Nazis or aliens or something wanted to take over society, they were wondering whose like brains to put chips in to do that most efficiently, that they should do that for the New York Times editorial board, which, you know, seemed like a really absurd thing for him to say, or I mean, for kind of the same reason as what I was saying earlier about Bezos, right? I mean, it's like, look, if you want to, I mean, you don't even need to take over the brains of the New York Times editorial board to change the editorial line of the New York Times. Just have the Salzburg family that, you know, that runs the New York Times. They can just fire those people and hire somebody else.
Right.
But yeah, so I think that sort of manufacturing of ideological consensus to him is like a big part of how he thinks this happens. But there is also a big emphasis on the sort of, you know, permanent infrastructure of the state, that, you know, that he thinks really drives, you know, what goes on in, you know, in society in general. That that you know, that the, you know, this is a sort of very common kind of, you know, right wing complaint. And even though Yarvin is, you know, very far from being a libertarian in certain respects, right? I mean, again, he's very, you know, he's very, very openly authoritarian. I think that, you know, I think that this is the sort of, you know, this is the sort of complaint that a lot of libertarians would make, that it's like, look at how much of day-to-day society is managed by these sort of regulatory bureaucracies that, you know, that stick around forever, and they, you know, sort of, you know, presidents come and go, right? You know, but most of the, you
The
know,
administrative state.
yeah, the administrative state stays the same, right? You know, and you know, and so again, I mean, I think that's why it's such a big point of, you know, of emphasis to him, you know, that we need to, you know, that we need to like get rid of a bunch of the personnel. Although I also suspect, I haven't looked at what he's said very recently on his blog or whatever, but I some of what I've seen from him before does make me think that he probably wishes, that the Trump administration would have a little bit more finesse about it, right? Because like, you know, I guess I will just say, right? I mean, something, last week I was talking to our friend Bronco Marchditch, and he actually did say something about the new Trump administration that did make me feel a little bit better, which was that he said that, if you look at all of the sort of successful strongmen around the world who've like really managed to like consolidate, you know, authoritarian power and like sort of weaken, you know, previous democratic, you know, institutions, you know, your Viktor Orbans and, you know, I don't know, Putin, Modi, right? You know, Erdogan, all those people, right? Like none of them quite showed up in office and started doing really chaotic, crazy shit like the next week, you know, in quite the way that Trump has been doing, right? You know, that because I think they were all sort of smart enough to realize that they had to consolidate, their power and support a little bit more than that. So I don't know how much comfort you can take from that, but take it for whatever it's worth.
Interesting, interesting. Well, we're coming up on an hour, but one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about also was that
Yeah.
uh, who are the philosophical influences of Yarvin? Is he a Nietzsche guy? I mean, who do you think?
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm trying to think if I've seen Yarvin explicitly talk about Nietzsche. I know he really loves Thomas Carlyle, right? I've seen him, um, mention him a bunch. I do think, I do think that, and he's very, you know, I mean, he is. Oh God, I mean, I'm just trying to think. Like, I've even heard him talk about like Disraeli, and it's. I think that you know he is somebody who generally assumes that anything that like people generally thought in stuff that he's read from more than a couple hundred years ago is sort of like the kind of or more certainly more than like the longer ago than the late 19th century is like sort of more likely to be correct than things that people agree on more recently, right? In that conversation about like national characters and all that, he sort of invoked like, oh, 200 years ago everybody just took this for granted, as if that were some like great argument in favor of thinking that. I think that I guess the reason like the thing that does seem whether or not Nietzsche is a big conscious influence, the thing that does seem very Nietzschean about the Yarvin worldview, right, uh, is this the belief that like sort of that society in a certain way should be ordered around people achieving great deeds, that
Uh,
like again, I mean, I just have to go back to this like really strange like childlike romanticization that he has of like genius tech CEOs, right? That which is which is also worth saying. I mean, it's like it really is. I mean, I don't know, whatever. Maybe everybody watching this already knows this, but it's like it really does seem like painfully naive to me that like he really thinks that like all of this technological progress is sort of because of these lone visionaries, when and like I remember seeing like he did this interview a few months ago in the New York Times where he was sort of talking about why you needed these like visionary CEOs to get that stuff accomplished, and like the way he's talking about it, he's like, oh yeah, imagine if that had to be sort of done by government bureaucracy. There was like the California Department of Computing, right? Then we'd like never have this stuff. And it's like, I don't know, man. If you look at the actual history of tech in the United States, it kind of is the California Department of Computing, right? I mean, computing, right? It's like it's the I always like that's like the only time I'd ever tell anybody to watch to watch a TED talk. Mariana Mazzucato, who wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State, she does this thing where she looks at an iPhone and she's like, look, everything that makes this a smartphone, right? The internet itself, the global positioning system, the touchscreen technology. I mean, this stuff was all developed in the public sector. It was, it's like in the Defense Department and, in public universities and, labs that were getting NIH funding, right? So, I think that like even as a view of the gadgets, right? I think this is really very deeply misleading, right? But I also think that in a certain sense, liberals often don't quite know what to say in response to some of these points because look, I mean, they too sort of assume that you need the entrepreneurial genius of capitalism
Because
to
they hate the state as well. They love capitalism. They don't have a critique of its effect on the public. We haven't had liberals who believed in this state in years.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And frankly, they also share quite a bit of his distrust of the general public and sort of belief in that technocratic experts are going to run things. They just they just want them to be they just want them to be like nice enlightened liberal experts, right? So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. So, are there any other thoughts you think we should know about Charles Yarvin and the Dark Enlightenment going forward? What we should look for?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would. I think that I'm trying to think what we haven't covered. I mean, I guess maybe the last thing I would say is I would just kind of circle and underline what I just said, that that to the extent that this is something that you worry about, and I think you should be worried about it. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate that. I don't think that I don't think that the sort of like house intellectuals of any movement are sort of the primary thing that drives that movement, right? But I also think that this guy is very bad news, and it's worrying that the vice president of the United States, right, has such positive things to say about it, right, to say the least. Um, and so to whatever extent you do need to worry about these people's influence. I think that I think that it's a good. I think that it has to be. I think it has to be countered by something better than the status quo liberalism that it like sort of rises up in opposition to. Just because I think that to whatever extent that you're worried about people being influenced by this stuff, it's they're like they're influenced by it again in part because of that ambient dissatisfaction that with the status quo we talked about, because there are lots of good reasons to be dissatisfied with the status quo. And frankly, I mean, like if you have sort of liberals who don't really believe in the capacity of the state, and who certainly don't believe in economic democracy. I mean, like they agree with Curtis Yarvin that you have to have dictatorship within the workplace. They just kind of disagree about whether that should extend to the public square. I mean, I think it's just going to be a much weaker response than you can give if you actually believe in democracy and human equality. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.